The dusk settled over the dusty expanse of Carrow's End like a mournful hymn, transforming the once scorched plains into a twilight tapestry of ochre and charcoal. At the edge of the town's lone thoroughfare, an aging wooden sign creaked. In the wind, its letters nearly eroded. "Welcome to Carrow's End, a town forgotten by time." Very few ventured this far west, and those who did rarely lingered. The wind carried whispers of old legends, of lost souls, of desperate men and women who sought a place to carve out a living in a land that seemed determined to swallow them whole. In this forsaken world, Jedediah Moore stood atop a narrow bluff, overlooking the plains. His tall frame, clad in a worn leather duster, cast a long shadow as he surveyed the land. The rancher's broad shoulders and strong hands spoke of years of toil beneath the sun, wresting a living from the cruel soil. But tonight, the lines etched into his weather-beaten face hinted at something more, an anxiousness that welled deep in his chest. Below, the plains stretched to the horizon, punctuated only by the jagged silhouettes of distant rock formations. A low, mournful wind swept across the grasses, stirring the tumbleweeds into motion. Beyond the outcroppings, Jedediah could make out a faint flicker of torchlight, the telltale sign of a raider party encamped for the night. Raiders, merciless men who preyed on isolated communities and vulnerable travelers. In recent weeks, they had grown brazen, targeting ranches for supplies, livestock, and any helpless souls they could capture and sell. Carrow's End had already lost more than half its able bodies to their kidnappings and extortions. Jedediah's pulse quickened. He'd come to this desolate outpost in search of a new start after the massacre that claimed his wife and son. The solitude had offered a brittle sort of peace until the raiders arrived. Now they threatened to strip him of the only thing that remained dear, his land, his freedom, and perhaps even his life. A sharp clink echoed below, and Jedediah's keen eyes captured the movement of the raiders' horses as they grazed around the flickering fire. He drew in a steadying breath and reached down to the rail where he rested his hand. Below sat a small wooden crate, its slats battered and stained with dust and dried blood. Inside lay a young girl. She was slight, scarcely more than a wisp of a person, her small frame curled awkwardly in the cramped space. Copper hair spilled over her forehead, tangled and grimy. Her tattered calico dress hung from her shoulders like a ragged banner. At first glance, she seemed resigned to her fate, her pale blue eyes cast downward. But there was an ember behind. Those eyes, a flicker of defiance that refused to be extinguished. Jedediah extended a gloved hand toward the crate. He hesitated only a moment before prying it open. The hinges protested with a groan, and dust drifted in the dying light. The girl flinched but did not cry out. Jedediah knelt beside the crate and reached inside, lifting her out. She was lighter than he'd expected, and he nearly lost his grip as her body slackened in his arms. Jedediah caught her beneath the knees, settling her gently onto the ground. The toil of rescuing her had carved new lines into his face, but he spoke softly. "Easy now. You're safe." She blinked up at him, her gaze wary. There was no fear, only a hollow weariness, like a candle reduced to a fragile wick. Jedediah frowned. She did not speak. Her lips remained still, uncurved. He opened his mouth as if to ask her name, but before the words could escape, she turned. Her head to the side, crimson stained the corner of her mouth. "By the saints," Jedediah muttered, kneeling to inspect her. A long, jagged scar traced from her cheek down to her jawline. Half-healed and angry-looking, the raw flesh had been crudely cauterized, likely by a shotgun blast meant to silence her. Her mute status was no mystery now. No wonder she didn't. "Scream!" he whispered. He laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "What's your name?" Her eyes flickered with pain, and for a fleeting moment he thought he saw tears gather, but then they steadied. Stillness returned, as resolute as stone. Jedediah realized something startling. This girl had not uttered a single word since he found her. Not a whisper, not a whimper. He propped her up against a barrel, searching her face for signs of understanding. "Who did this to you?" he asked, pressing lightly just beneath her torn lip. She flinched once, but her eyes met his, clear and unblinking. No answer came. He felt a tugging in his chest, a mix of sympathy and frustration. Jedediah had lost people to raiders before, friends, tenants, a neighbor's son. But no one he had ever taken in carried the weight of silence like this girl did. It unsettled him. He needed answers, but for now words would not come. He glanced back down at the raider camp. The firelight flickered as one of the raiders tossed a log into the blaze. The man chuckled, rugged and cruel, revealing a missing tooth. Jedediah's jaw clenched. He couldn't believe how close he'd come, how easily his life could have ended. "You're coming with me," he said to the girl, rising to his feet. He slung an arm under her shoulders and hoisted her up. She weighed almost nothing, but Jedediah supported her carefully, cradling her close to his chest. As they began the slow trek back to Jedediah's ranch, a ramshackle cluster of cabins and corrals perched on the outskirts of Carrow's End, the girl's head lolled against his chest. The night air carried the scent of sage and ash. A crescent moon peaked above the horizon, helpless against the encroaching shadows. They moved in silence, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. Jedediah's thoughts raced. He'd paid the raiders a king's ransom for her freedom. Nearby towns had offered silver and livestock, but the girl's value had been greater. Rumors swirled of her mysterious past, of a family slaughtered, of a cruel master. He shook his head as though to banish the rumors. He didn't need to know her past. He only knew that he couldn't leave her to the raiders. An hour's walk brought them to the porch of his modest homestead. A single lantern swayed under the eaves, casting a warm glow across the threshold. As he stepped onto the creaking wooden planks, the girl's pale face emerged from the darkness. Finally, a gust of wind lifted loose strands of copper hair from her forehead, revealing eyes that reflected both fear and defiance. "You're safe here," Jedediah said again, guiding her toward the battered door. Inside, the cabin was sparse. A rough-hewn table, a couple of chairs, and a stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. The scent of wood smoke mingled with leather and dust. Jedediah settled the girl onto a chair. By lamplight he studied her features. High cheekbones dusted with freckles, lips thin and bruised, eyes unnaturally clear against her pale skin. She sniffled once, and Jedediah set a basin of water and a rag before her. Carefully, she cleaned her face, wincing at the sting of dried blood. He watched her every move, feeling a fierce protectiveness rise. He placed a bowl of stew and a loaf of stale bread on a nearby table. The girl hesitated but reached for the bowl. She held the spoon awkwardly, bringing it to her lips. The stew was lukewarm and thin, a simple mix of root vegetables and shredded beef. Her eyes brightened the slightest bit as she tasted it, as though nourishment had awakened something within. Jedediah shifted his weight, restless. He put out his hand, half offering, half demanding, "Name!" She looked up, defiance etched in her expression. A slow flush of anger colored her cheeks. In a quick motion, her hand flew to the locket that rested against her throat beneath her tattered dress. With trembling fingers, she unclasped it and opened the faded silver cover. Inside, a tiny portrait of a woman with the same copper hair stared back. Her gaze flickered to Jedediah. For a heartbeat, her lips parted. Then she closed them, glancing, and down at the locket once more. "Azura," she whispered finally. Not aloud, but in a movement of her lips so subtle, Jedediah caught only a faint hint of the syllables. He stared, stunned. His eyes flicked to the door, as though seeking confirmation, but the night remained silent. "Azura," he repeated, voice firm but gentle. "All right, Azura," You've got a name." A tremor ran through her, and she set the locket aside, folding her hands in her lap. Jedediah realized that even though her voice had broken the silence, she would not speak again. Not here, not now, perhaps never. He cleared his throat and crossed to the hearth, crouching low to stoke the embers. A small fire roared to life, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. "I found you out there," he said, glancing back at her. "Would you rather be alone? I mean, living in that crate for who knows how long. You'd think you might choose that. But you let me pull you out, and you ate my stew. That's not the sign of someone who wants to be alone, Azura." She shifted, meeting his gaze. There was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, something beyond mere survival. Jedediah took it as a small victory. "I suppose I should introduce myself properly," he continued, offering his hand. "Name's Jedediah Moore, rancher at Carrow's End. Folks call this place Moore Ranch, though it's hardly a ranch and not really much of a place." He managed a half smile, but it faltered. "I don't know what happened to your folks." Jedediah hesitated, selecting his words carefully. "But you're safe here. You can rest." Azura let her head fall, as though gathering the fragments of her courage. She nodded once. "Good," Jedediah said. He rose to his full height, brushing the dust from his sleeves. "Got some chores to tend tomorrow. We'll get you settled, but for now, get some rest." He turned toward the door, stopping only to ensure she had enough water and blankets stacked on the chair. "Sleep well, Azura," he said, and he stepped outside into the night. Once outside, he closed the door softly behind him. The wind had grown stronger, rattling the cabin and tugging at his coat. Jedediah felt the weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders, heavier than any saddlebag he'd ever carried. He gazed back at the cabin, where a faint light shone. Through the window he saw Azura's silhouette, hunched and vulnerable. Jedediah whispered a silent prayer into the night, hoping that sleep would bring her some reprieve. The next morning the sun peaked above the horizon, its pale rays cutting through the lingering chill. Jedediah rode Azura on a gentle horse, guiding her through the dusty plains toward the ranch's corrals. His broad-brimmed hat shaded his face, though the lines of worry remained etched. Azura sat beside him, clutching a small satchel containing the locket and a single loaf of bread. She wore a new plain dress, sturdy cloth in muted brown, provided by Jedediah the night before. Her silence felt less oppressive in the open air, replaced instead by her eyes, which took in everything: the rough wood of the fence posts, the scuffed leather reins, the distant sheep grazing in the pastures. Each detail impressed itself upon her mind like a scene painted in vivid watercolor. Jedediah guided the horse into a fenced corral where several other ranch hands worked the livestock. A lanky man with a bushy beard nodded at them. Another younger fellow tossed a rope over a saddle horn. "Jed," called the bushy-bearded man, "we got 6 head of heifers down by the ravine. Need to move 'em to the north pen before the sun gets too high." Jedediah nodded. "I'll be there in a minute." He dismounted, setting Azura's legs gently against the horse's side. "Azura, stay on the fence for now," he instructed, though he did not expect a reply. She moved obediently to a nearby rail, draping her satchel over her shoulder. Jedediah moved to the gate, lowered it, and whistled sharply. The horse came. "Forward!" and he led it back to the stable, urging the other hands to start rounding up the heifers. Left alone for a few moments, Azura stepped from the fence. The corral floor was strewn with hay and dust. She knelt and brushed a fallen clump of hay from her dress. The bustle of ranch life surrounded her. The clanking of tools, the rare snort of a cow, the thud of hoofbeats as horses were broken and saddled. She ran a fingertip along the rail, tracing the grooves worn by countless hands. Memories flitted at the edges of her mind. Hers were fragmented: a mother's lullaby, a father's boots clumping on wood floors, the laughter of siblings and the sudden crack of gunfire. But when she focused, the memories receded like ghosts at dawn. All that remained was the present, the morning sun, the smell of fresh earth, the looming threat of raiders who'd taken everything from her. She tapped her satchel and ran her fingers over the locket's cool surface. The portrait inside swam before her eyes, and she pressed her lips together to keep from speaking. Instead, she breathed in, centering herself. A sudden commotion caught her attention. Herds of cattle, their tails flicking, galloped from the ravine toward the corral. The younger ranch hand trained a rope on a stray heifer, looping it deftly around its horn. Another man clucked loudly, guiding the herd with sharp yelps. Jedediah was at the front of the rush, a commanding presence who barked orders and shifted his weight to guide the horses. Azura watched as he moved between horse and cattle, corralling them with practiced skill. His silhouette was framed against the rising sun, a man shaped by hardship, yet driven by necessity. A sudden shout pierced the air. One of the heifers bolted, its eyes panicked and threw its head. The ranch hands scattered, horses reared. In one fluid motion, Jedediah leapt between the sprinting heifer and a stumbling stable hand, redirecting the animal with a rope that cinched tight around its neck. The beast bucked and screamed, but Jedediah held firm, his knuckles white with tension. Azura's heart pounded at the raw display of strength. It was the first time she'd seen him in motion, not as a savior, but as a seasoned rancher whose life meant constant vigilance. The heifer finally subsided, wings of foam gathering at its mouth. Jedediah released the rope, guiding the exhausted creature into the corral. As chaos settled, Jedediah turned and noticed Azura standing nearby. He'd forgotten she was there. His gaze softened, and he wiped sweat from his brow. "Azura," he said, though his voice carried a touch of pride and an unspoken apology. "You're quick-eyed. Most folks would have jumped back. But you stayed. I appreciate that." Azura nodded. She did not smile or speak, but something in her eyes spoke of gratitude and trust. "Let's get you settled," Jedediah said. He beckoned her to follow him. Together they walked toward a modest outbuilding at the edge of the corral. Inside, a single cot lay against a wooden wall, topped with a coarse wool blanket. A small window framed a view of the plains. A wooden bucket sat on the floor. "This is yours," Jedediah said, placing a folded blanket on the cot. "You'll get used to the wind. It's relentless out here." Azura traced the grain of the floorboards with hesitant steps. She inhaled and exhaled, familiarizing herself with the scent of straw and pine. "I'll be back after noon," Jedediah said. "The town's getting ready for the quartering, tax season. I might need to ride in to trade some cattle." "Don't wander off the ranch, all right? Dangerous roads." She nodded, tucking the locket inside her dress. Jedediah tipped his hat. "Rest now. We'll meet again for supper." He closed the door behind him, leaving Azura alone in the dusty silence. She sank onto the cot, gaze drifting to the window where the sky was a pale blue smudge. A single raven perched on a broken fence post, its beady eyes watching. A thundercloud gathered on the horizon, dark and ominous. Azura rose and moved to the window, pressing her fingertips against the cool glass. She sensed movement along the fence line, shadows shifting like smoke. Her pulse quickened. She retreated from the window, heart pounding. Azura paced the small room, mind racing with questions. Who was her family? Could she ever speak again? Did Jedediah see her as a burden? Perhaps he'd come to regret his decision as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. She realized she was trembling, part fear, part anticipation. She set her satchel and lingered by the cot, picking up the locket once more. Studying the portrait, she felt a familiar ache, a memory too faint to grasp fully. Suddenly the door creaked open. Jedediah stepped inside, concern etched on his face. "Are you well?" he asked, eyes flicking to her trembling hands. Azura nodded numbly, placing the locket in her pocket. Though she could not speak, her eyes conveyed determination. Good, Jedediah said. Get some rest while you can. I'll check on you before I ride out. She nodded again. He gave a final glance and left. Alone, Azura slid to the floor against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. The lamplight cast long shadows across the barren floor. She closed her eyes, willing sleep to come, but her mind roiled with a single thought. Tomorrow, the raiders would return. She could feel it in the air, a sickening tension that clung to her skin like static. The memory of her time in that crate flickered as she imagined their brutal faces, their boots stomping on splintered wood. She breathed slowly, calming her racing heart. "I won't be afraid," she whispered into the dark, a vow uttered in silence. The room stretched quiet, and as Azura sank into a restless sleep, the wind outside rose into a mournful wail, rattling the outbuilding's door. The plains beyond lay silent, vulnerable. The raiders' camp was no longer visible, but that did not mean they were gone. In the pre-dawn darkness, a lone hawk soared overhead, its cry a harbinger of what was to come. And somewhere beyond the horizon, jagged clouds gathered, ready to unleash their fury. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow I have a special story for you. The dawn sky was a pale wash of pink and gold, but Carrow's End did not know peace. As the first shafts of sunlight crested the distant mesas, Azura stirred, her breath shallow as if she still lingered in the restless energy of her dreams. The creak of the door roused her fully. Jedediah entered quietly, his heavy boots leaving faint smudges upon the wooden floor. Beside his dark eyes was a worry he tried, or pretended, not to show. He paused by the cot, adjusting the blanket. Without speaking, he set a clay pot of steaming porridge on a small stool. The steam spiraled toward the low ceiling, carrying the scent of boiled oats and sweetened goat's milk, a simple fare, but enough to kindle Azura's appetite. She watched him in silence, fingers curled around the blanket. In those early hours, the world felt suspended between night's shadows and the promise of day. "Eat," Jedediah said, stepping away toward the door. "I'm riding out to scout the southern bluff. Heard word at the saloon that the raiders are regrouping. I'll be back before noon." Azura nodded, her throat tight. She had learned more about Jedediah in these past 24 hours than she had ever known of kindness. He saw her not as a mute cargo to abandon, but as a person with a pulse, and perhaps a purpose. He believed she could find solace and utility in his isolated life. The thought both warmed and alarmed her. She dared not appear vulnerable, yet relief flickered in her chest, gentle as butterfly wings. With trembling hands, she cupped a spoon of porridge and brought it to her lips. The taste spread warmth through her veins, and for a moment, Azura allowed herself the fleeting comfort of sensation. Heat in her belly, the rough wooden spoon between her fingers, the hum of Jedediah's boots receding down the creaky hallway. She sat at the edge of the cot, studying the floorboards. Spider. Cracks in the wood snaked beneath her fingertips. She wondered how long the ranch had stood, how many footsteps had pounded these boards, beneath heavier burdens than her own. Her gaze drifted to the small window, revealing a flock of buzzards circling overhead, hunting what remained of the day before's stray carcasses. Their cries were faint on the wind, but to Azura they sounded like the heralds of judgment. By noon the sun had climbed steadily overhead, its unyielding heat pressing against Azura as she toiled in Jedediah's barn. The smell of hay and livestock clung to her dress, and sweat glinted on her forehead. Jedediah had insisted she learn tasks rather than merely wait. He taught her how to muck stalls, to shovel excrement into a wheelbarrow and wheel it away. He guided her hand as she fed the horses, fresh-cut hay, a bucket of grain. At first she stumbled, her movements awkward, her silence conspicuous. But after an hour of sweat and bruised knuckles, she found rhythm in the labor. As midday approached, Jedediah motioned her to a trough where water sloshed cold and clear. He handed her a rag and pointed to the fledgling colt behind him. The foal trembled as it drank, ribs not yet filled out. Jedediah whispered that it had been abandoned when the mother had been shot by a roaming coyote. He'd brought the colt in to nurture it back to health. "Go on," he said. "Wash its muzzle." Azura approached slowly, trepidation rippling beneath her skin. The colt flinched, its eyes wide and fearful, but she held steady, dipping the rag into the cool water and wiping its reddened muzzle. The colt's soft nicker resonated in her chest, soothing the knot of anxiety. "Good girl," Jedediah murmured, though he knew she would not hear. By late afternoon, Azura's muscles ached. Her dress was stained with mud and dust, and the sun had baked her skin to a dull bronze. Yet a quiet pride glowed within her, an affirmation that she could contribute, that she was more than brokenness. The sense of purpose felt foreign and exhilarating, yet laced with dread. What did the future hold? The raiders were gathering. Would her usefulness matter when barrels thundered across the corral and pistols cracked like thunderclaps? That evening, Jedediah returned from his ride. He rode across the dusty yard, the horse's flanks heaving with fatigue. Dismounting, he removed the saddle, his movements weary but deliberate. "They're moving south," he said, roughly patting the horse's neck. "Maybe 30 strong. Shouldn't be much trouble for us if we're ready." He spat, scanning. "The skies might hit us within the week." Azura lingered by the barn entrance, wiping her hands on a rag. She felt a tremor ripple through her as Jedediah's words sunk in. Raiders, 30 strong, meant more than a bad mood. It meant war. Jedediah took a tattered map from his saddlebag and spread it on a nearby crate. The edges curled from age. The ink faded, but the outline of the ranch, the ravine, the distant mesa were all clear enough. He traced a finger along a path. "They'll come from the west, up the arroyo. We'll set a trap." Azura stepped closer, her breath catching. Jedediah's gaze shifted. He looked at her as one might consider whether a blade was sharp enough for its task. "You understand?" he said, as if seeking confirmation. "I'll need you to man the south lookout. Keep watch from the ridge. Let me know the moment you see dust or hear hoofbeats. Understand?" Azura met his eyes unwaveringly. Her pulse beat like a hammer, but her face remained calm enough for Jedediah to believe she understood his meaning. She inclined her head once, a gesture that satisfied him more than words. "Good. We'll gather the other hands tomorrow morning. Get some rest." That night, as she lay on her cot in the outbuilding, Azura imagined the faces of the raiders, their cruel sneers, the glint of steel, the rage that drove them to break. Lives for profit. She wrapped her arms around herself as if bracing for the storm to come, but beneath the fear, a fierce ember flared. She vowed to stand sentinel, to watch, to defend this fragile sanctuary. Sleep eluded her until the moon had risen high above the plains. In the pale light, she rose and moved to the window, tapping her knuckles against the wood frame. The night was silent but for the distant call of owls and the soft rustling of wind through the sagebrush. She pressed her palm to the cool glass and stared out, as though willing her eyes to pierce the blackness. Time passed in ragged breaths. Then came the faintest hiss, the distant scrape of hooves on stone. Azura's heart thundered. She pressed her ear against the frame, listening. Again the sound, far off but undeniable. "They're coming," she whispered into the darkness. No announcement heralded the morning. The sun rose in a haze of blood orange, but the ranch was already stirring. Jedediah had mustered his hands at dawn, briefing them on positions. 4 men, Joab, the lanky, bearded ranch hand, Simeon, the younger fellow with the keen eyes, Elder Witt, a retired sheriff with one arm, and Riel, one of the only other women on the ranch, stood ready. They stationed themselves behind stacks of hay bales and broken fence rails, shotguns, and rifles in hand. Azura floated between them and the ridge. Her boots crunched the gravel as she climbed to her post, a small pock in a rock formation, barely a lookout, but enough to see the plains stretch out beneath her. She took her position, bowing to the bones of an old fence post, and settled into stillness. Her eyes, honed by days of silent observation, scanned the horizon. Behind her, Jedediah organized the makeshift defenses, barrels of gunpowder hidden beneath planks rigged to tip if pushed, oil laid on certain paths to create slick traps. He kept one hand on his rifle and the other on a crude bell tied to the fence, a tripwire alarm he'd strung himself. If the raiders reached the south gate, he would ring that bell, and the entire ranch would know to hold fire. Azura felt sweat bead between her shoulder blades, despite the cool morning air. She swallowed hard, aware of the weight of responsibility pressing down upon her. In the days since she'd arrived, she had learned to read the ranch, the way Jedediah's spine stiffened when he sensed danger, the way the horses grew restless when raiders rode too close. Now those lessons were her compass. She raised her chin, squinting into the distance. The plains shimmered as though hiding beneath a veil of heat and dust. The mesas in the distance looked like phantom sentinels, their ridges jagged and defiant. A lone vulture circled where a carcass lay. The world seemed suspended, breathless, then a flicker like a camera flash of movement. Azura tensed, her breathing shallow. She saw hoofprints imprinted in the soft dirt, moving slowly like a bronc's reluctant descent. She traced the line of hoofprints back to the edge of the plateau. That's where they would appear. "Joab," she called, voice soft but urgent. "They're coming from the west." Joab rounded the rocky outcropping, his shotgun cradled in his arms. He nodded, and his face darkened. He motioned for Simeon and the others to move into position. Azura felt the tremor between her legs stiffen, but she held fast, her gaze never wavering. Time slowed. It always did before violence. The distant hoofprints grew into dusty silhouettes, a ragtag host of men on horseback, their faces obscured by bandanas and brimmed hats. Azura swallowed. Her pulse echoed like a drum in her ears. "They're almost here," she whispered, though no one else needed to be told. All eyes turned to the ridge. The raiders spurred their horses forward, dust kicking up behind them. The crash of hooves against rock reached a crescendo. They moved as a single organism, hungry and violent, and then, in that moment of suspended chaos, a note drifted on the wind, high, airy, insistent, a single whistle, clear, pure, unfathomably ancient. All of Caro's End froze. Jedediah's. Rifle dropped an inch. Simeon tightened his grip on his shotgun, shoulders rigid. The horses whinnied and stamped. Even the wind paused, as though holding its breath. Azura stood as still as a statue, her eyes locked on the raiders. Their horses skidded to a halt, heads whipped around, eyes wide, as they searched the ridge for the source of that haunting, lonely melody. And then the cliffhanger that stole all courage as the raiders reined in. Their leader, a towering brute named Blackridge, lifted his hand and shouted, "What witchcraft is this? Who's fooling with us?" No one answered, but Azura's lips parted, and the next note of her whistle carried on the wind, slicing through fear and leaving only wonder in its wake. A hush fell over the plateau as Azura's whistle soared above the tumult. Its pure, haunting timbre wound through the raiders' ranks, weaving around their horses' hooves and burrowing into the core of every startled man. For a moment, not a single soul dared breathe. The plains themselves seemed to enthrall at the sound. Blackridge, broad-shouldered and cloak-draped, jerked his head skyward, scanning the ridgeline for its source. The bandana across his face did nothing to hide the flicker of uncertainty in his grey eyes. The other raiders whispered among themselves, uneasy. Their horses shifted, eyes wide, as if they sensed a predator greater than any man hidden among the rocks. But it was Azura, alone, perched above them, her cheeks flushed, lips curved around the whistle with purpose. Below, the horses' manes, whipped like banners in a gale, sweat slick and anxious. Their riders hesitated, hands resting on holsters, skeins of fear unraveling in the air. Azura felt the breath catch in her chest. In that frozen heartbeat she tasted steel and sagebrush and something ancient, power surging through her veins. Her whole body vibrated with the effort to produce that note, the same melody her mother had taught, a lullaby meant to call in. Dawn, now repurposed as a siren to unnerve the wicked. Below, one of the raiders, a wiry man named Tassel, stumbled from his saddle, clutching his ears. He cried out, stumbling backward as if struck. The note pierced deeper than any bullet could, laying bare his soul and sending his mind reeling. Blackridge leaped down from his saddle, pacing the ground in furious circles. He smashed his fist into the earth and cursed in a low, guttural voice. "Find the witch! Kill her! If she's horsed among those rocks, I'll burn every ridge until the sun's blistered black." His order tore the spell that had descended, and the raiders surged forward, weapons drawn. Their horses reared, neighing as though begging them to flee. Azura watched with narrowed eyes. Fear trembled, but did not rule her. Below, Jedediah raised the bell tied to his saddle, its iron surface battered by countless skirmishes. One sharp ring echoed across the plains, a clarion call to arms. Rael seized her rifle and sprinted to the south gate. Elder Whit yanked Simeon toward the barrel pile, beckoning him to stand guard. Joab lifted his shotgun and crouched behind a broken fence line. The ranch hands moved like cogs in a well-oiled machine, all trained by Jedediah to react instantly to danger. Azura stepped back from the ridge, ducking between boulders. Her small frame contrasted with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She tucked the whistle beneath a jagged rock, then reached for the slender knife hidden at her ankle. It wasn't the weapon she would have chosen if she could have. Anything. A rusted blade, its edge notched from countless uses, but her only weapon. And tonight she would use it, even if it meant confronting this chaos head-on. Her pulse pounded as she descended, crouching behind the rocks, following the ridge's natural slope until she was close enough to see Blackridge's hulking form. He barked orders like a caged beast, but none of his men dared approach the ridge. Fear and confusion were new elements in their hardened hearts. Azura's breath shallowed as she watched Blackridge pace. She realized that just moments ago those men had meant to trample the ranch into oblivion. Now they stood uncertain, mere prey to her melody. "If you're going to strike, strike now," hissed Blackridge, spittle gathering at the corners of his mouth, "or I'll have you strung up on that ridge like a dog." But no one stepped forward. Azura felt a twitch of satisfaction, but the raider leader's threat twisted her stomach into a gnawing knot. She could not keep them at bay forever. Below, the ranch erupted. The bell's ring summoned a volley of rifles and shotguns. By Jedediah's signal, Rael fired into the approaching dust columns, sending the first bullets whistling through the dry air. The raiders' horses reared and whinnied, panic spreading. Some stumbled into one another, collapsing. Others bolted, dragging riders into the dirt. Flares of flame erupted as gunpowder met open flame, but that initial chaos only delayed them. By an instant, Blackridge roared, "Get to cover! Return fire! Kill every soul at those gates!" Azura gripped her knife handle tighter and edged closer to a narrow crevice in the rock face. She could hear the gunfire's dull roar and the thunder of hooves pounding the earth. The dynamic below was brutal. Men and horses tossed in a whirlwind of shot and smoke, curses and blood. Azura's heart pounded with every discharge. She slid into the crevice, pressing her back against its cool stone walls. Sweat beaded on her collarbone. Her ears rang. The world narrowed to the sounds of splintering wood and the ragged breaths of those near death. At the south gate, Rael crouched, reloading her rifle. She craned her neck, trying to see past the smoke. One of the raiders, a young man with a scar running down his cheek, charged, dragging his tired mount. Riel squeezed the trigger, and the echo rattled in her bones. The raider slumped and his horse toppled, but the next moment Riel's eyes widened in horror. The horse's thrashing leg had kicked the fence, sending Riel sprawling into the dust. She landed awkwardly, reverberating shock through her arm. Grunting, she scrambled to reload, ignoring the pain. A moment later, a bullet whipped past her ear, carving a swath through the air. She rolled to her side, pulling both knees under her to aim at the attackers. Then another explosion, this time at the North Corral, shook the ground. She recognized the crackle of a makeshift explosive, a keg of gunpowder set ablaze. Panic washed over her as she saw the corral fence buckle, releasing horses into the fray. The freed beasts stampeded into both the raiders and the ranch hands, creating a chaotic tangle of teeth, hooves, and limbs. "Reinforcements," Riel gritted out, her face set in a deathly pallor. "They're pressing hard on both sides." Elder Witt, propped against a barrel, barked orders with his one good arm. He drove men toward the west flank to hold the raiders at bay, but the unexpected stampede forced some to break ranks. Up on the ridge, Azura used the commotions, chorus to slip from the crevice. She darted between boulders, aiming to descend farther, closer to where Jedediah stood, orchestrating the counter-attack. Smoke spiraled around him. His long duster billowed like a tattered banner. He surveyed the chaos and directed his hands. With a brutal efficiency that belied the grief she had seen flicker behind his eyes. She admired him then, feeling the wellspring of trust deepen. She crept around the ridge's edge to find herself nearly at the lip of the battlefield. Through the haze of smoke and thundering hooves, she spotted Blackridge, despite his attempt at camouflage. The man was unmistakable, broad as a barn door, with a hook of a nose and a bandana colored the black of sin. He pointed a pistol at Jedediah, who raised his rifle. But before Jedediah could squeeze the trigger, two raider riders galloped into view, launching rifles that barked like stubbed toes. Bullets ricocheted from the surrounding rocks. The flash of lead tore near Azura's feet. The shockwave rattled her bones. Dust exploded around her, filling her lungs with grit. Her vision blurred. She fell to one knee, a haze of pain swirling in her mind as the world tilted. When she came to, the sky was dark overhead. The only light came from scattered embers and flickers of fire where barns had caught. The air choked with smoke and the acrid stench of gunpowder. Her cheek throbbed. She pressed trembling fingers to a welt forming above her jaw. The taste of blood was coppery on her tongue. She pushed herself to her feet, wavering. The battlefield lay strewn before her. Smouldering wreckage, burning fences, horses that had collapsed in agony, and bodies, both raiders and ranch hands, mangled by gunfire or trampled beneath hooves. She stumbled and spotted Jedediah kneeling beside Blackridge. The raider leader lay on his side, chest heaving. Jedediah's rifle rested on his thigh. Azura saw the bandana soaked red. Blood spurted from a wound just beneath his ribs. Blackridge snarled, voice raspy with bile and pain. "You can't kill me, ranch rat." Jedediah's jaw narrowed. "I don't need to, Blackridge. You'll tell me the names of every scumbag you ride with, and I'll drag you back to town. Carrow's End doesn't turn its back on justice." Blackridge coughed, spitting froth. "You and your mute girl. She's some witch, isn't she? Magic in those lungs." His eyes flicked toward Azura as though seeing her for the first time. Azura's blood ran churned at his words. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to raise her knife. Jedediah pressed the barrel of his rifle against Blackridge's temple. His voice was low, steady. "No magic, just survival. If you're strong enough to draw breath, you can tell what I'm asking." Blackridge wheezed, nodding slowly. "Begin," Jedediah said. Blackridge spat. "Hers will be the last lungs you ever hear, ranch rat." By dawn, the battlefield was a hushed ruin. Jedediah stood by a crude stretcher where Blackridge, now bandaged and shackled, lay quiet, drained of life's fury. A handful of surviving raiders shackled themselves, stared at the ground. Elder Witt knelt beside a fallen steed, murmuring a prayer. Azura crouched at the edge of the field, listening to the rasp of dying embers. Her cheek throbbed, but the pain was distant now, overshadowed by a deep, hollow fatigue. Rain clouds gathered to the north, promising a reprieve from the inferno made of gunpowder and blood. Joab approached, double-barreled shotgun slung over his shoulder. "You did good, girl," he said quietly. "That whistle saved us all." Azura shrugged, head bowed. She refused to rise from the weight she carried. Every life lost still weighed on her soul. "Come," Jedediah said, appearing at her side. "We've got to bury the dead." She stood and followed him as they moved toward a small ridge. There, the surviving ranch hands had begun digging. They worked in silence, pausing only to toss earth and cover bodies with crude wooden crosses. With each spade of dirt, Azura felt a drumbeat in her chest, grief and regret pounding in unison. She knelt by Rael's form. The young woman's eyes were closed, but a faint rise and fall of her chest revealed she still lived. Relief washed through Azura, so fierce it nearly knocked her to the ground. "She'll live," Jedediah murmured. Bullet grazed her side. Azura laid her palm on Rael's forehead. The warmth pulsed faintly beneath her palm. "We need help," Joab said, breaking the hushed stillness. "We can't dig all day. We ought to request the marshal for reinforcements." Jedediah shook his head. "Marshal's miles off, and by the time he gets here, raiders still roam. We can't leave Carrow's End undefended." A tension coiled within Azura. Fear of more bloodshed mingled with a grim determination to stand fast. She rose and surveyed the ridge, picking apart the jagged edges, the blackened soil, the horses' lifeless remains. A single raven perched atop a charred fence post, feeding on carrion. "They won't come back," she said quietly, and all eyes turned toward her. "They're beaten. They'll limp back to their holes. Nothing left for them here." Jedediah stared, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. "Maybe you're right," he said at last, "but I want to be ready." Later that afternoon, a thin drizzle began, falling like tears for the fallen. The ranch hands huddled inside the barn, tending to wounds and cleaning weapons. Jedediah stood at the entrance, scanning the horizon, as though expecting another wave of riders to crest the ridge. Azura approached him, her steps hesitant. "You done enough for one day?" Jedediah said without turning. "Come inside." Azura shook her head, eyes fixed ahead. "Promise me you'll rest," he said, turning at last. His gaze softened. "I can't lose you." She swallowed, reminding herself that words were not her method of expression. She offered him a steady, quiet gaze. "If they return," she said at last, her first real words since he had rescued her, "I will stand." Jedediah's face went taut. "I know." He reached out and placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "We rest now," he said. Sulfuric clouds gathered overhead, rumbling with silent menace. Azura closed her eyes, feeling the weight of each breath. Even as rain began to patter, she sensed a deeper storm brewing, not just in the sky, but within her. Night fell with a mournful wail, and the rain came down in sheets. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the ranch in jagged flashes. Azura huddled beside Jedediah inside the barn, wrapped in a rough blanket. The warmth of the stables was heavy with the scent of damp hay and anxious horses. Jedediah knelt beside her, pressing a bowl of stew to her lips. The rich broth steamed, its scent mixing with the rain's tang. Azura sipped slowly, feeling the warmth return to her frost-bitten core. A sudden crash of thunder made the horses rear. Their panicked whinnies echoed through the barn. Azura's eyes widened. Outside, the wind howled a dirge, rattling the wooden planks with ferocity. She clutched the blanket tighter, heart pounding. "Stay here," Jedediah said. "Root them. Keep them calm." He rose and dashed toward the stable doors, yanking them open against the storm. Jagged lightning flashed. The world bared its bones for a moment. Yet beyond the horses, Azura saw movement beyond the paddocks, shadowed figures creeping through the downpour, their forms blurred by rain. Raider figures. Azura's blood turned to ice. She bolted to Jedediah's side. "They're back," she said. Jedediah's jaw clenched. "The storm's hiding them." She turned, gaze darting across the barn's stalls. The horses were blind with fear, their panicked energy a tinderbox, ready to ignite with a single spark. The raider silhouettes edged closer, their hulking forms emerging through the slanted rain. Ender cliffhanger. In the barn's shadows, Azura heard the rasp of boots against wood, then a guttural whisper, one she recognized from days past, coming ever closer to the stall she shared with Jedediah. The tumble of thunder rattled the rafters as Azura pressed herself against the stall partition, her pulse thrumming like the hooves of a stampeding herd. The horses in the barn shuddered and nickered, crowded in stall after stall, their breath visible in the chill, damp air. Raindrops pounded the roof with unforgiving force, and the lantern's flames flickered as if struggling against a gale. Jedediah stood by the open barn doors, shoulders squared against the deluge. His vest had soaked through, water dripping in rivulets down his broad back. He scanned the paddocks with hawk-like intensity, senses honed by years of danger. Behind him, the horses stamped nervously, their manes slicked to their necks. "Stay." "Lo," Jedediah murmured to Azura, yet his voice carried a hardness that concealed his fear. "Keep the horses calm." Azura nodded, pressing a palm gently against the neck of the mare in the stall beside her. The horse's flanks heaved, and her eyes rolled wide. Azura's breath hitched as the mare pulled back, but Azura's calm tone and steady hand eased the horse's panic somewhat. It was then she realized, if the horses bolted, they would trample everyone in the barn. She could not let that happen. A faint creak echoed from the door's hinges. Jedediah's gaze snapped toward the entrance. By the horse manure-smeared boards, the raiders crept in. Figures cloaked in sodden leathers perched on soaked hay bales to push the door open just enough. Blackridge's lieutenant, a gaunt man known as Gallo, shoved the plank aside. He stepped, in first, rain dripping from his hat into a small puddle at his feet. The scent of wet leather and rusted metal emanated from him like a rancid perfume. "Jedediah Moore," Gallo snarled, voice lowered as if savoring the storm's cover. "Your sniping cost us enough. Now you'll suffer for stopping Blau." He stopped abruptly as one of the horses reared, the thunder of their hooves jolting the barn's beams. "Watch them," Blackridge growled from the doorway, voice muffled by the sheet of rain. "Stay clear of the horses. We're here for the girl." His eyes, cold and calculated, swept to the far side of the barn. "They say she sings death." Azura's fingers tightened around the strap of her blade. She flinched as the mare shivered, ears pinned back. The horse whinnied and struck at the stall bars as if sensing something vile. Jedediah took a step forward, thudding boots on the soaked wooden planks. "You don't get her back. She stays with me. We've nowhere else." "To go," Gallo spat, dragging a pistol from his duster. "She's worth a fortune to our new master. Tell us where she is, or we burn this barn and kill every living creature inside." Azura's throat constricted. The pistol's barrel glistened under the lantern light, carved with dreadnought etchings. She sensed the horse's mounting panic. If Jedediah stood his ground, a stray bullet or a frightened stallion could rip the barn to pieces. She needed to act, but how? Her voice, once powerful enough to quell raiders, might fail amidst the din of thunder and gunfire. "Stand down," Jedediah said, though his voice wavered. "Azura isn't going anywhere. You'll leave my horses out of this." Blackridge shook his head slowly. Even through the rain, his smirk was visible. "Your horses don't matter. We want her alive. Get out of the way." Heat flared across. Azura's cheeks, and she swallowed hard. She knew what the raiders believed, that her whisper could topple them, but she could also die if her whistle alerted the others too soon. The storm, its chaos and clamor, provided her cover. She inhaled, bracing against the rising roar of thunder. In a fluid motion, she let out a sharp, twin whistle, softer than before, yet piercing through the murk. It rose in a single arc that seemed to slow time. Gallo staggered, clutching his head. Blackridge's jaw dropped, and he peered at the rafters as if searching for hidden sorcery. "She's here!" Blackridge roared, raising his pistol. "Find her!" Azura lurched from her stall, blade at the ready, moving between the horses and the raiders. Her boots dropped on the wet floor as she advanced, eyes fixed on Blackridge. The horses froze. Recognition of her presence had steadied them. "Don't hurt my horses!" Azura shouted, her voice slicing through the storm. She advanced rapidly, weapon pointed. Blackridge pivoted, pulling the trigger. The hammer clicked back, but in that instant, Jedediah moved like a panther. He jumped forward, slamming into Blackridge from the side. The pistol fired into the rafters, shattering a wooden beam. As Blackridge stumbled, Jedediah wrapped his arm around his neck and slammed him into the wet planks. Splinters flew. Gallo moved to draw his blade, but a heavy thud knocked him off. Balance, Riel's shotgun butt swinging underhand. The barn erupted in chaos. The raiders lunged, guns drawn, but Azura stood at the forefront, blade glinting, a fierce look in her eyes. She moved like a wraith, stepping between fleeing horses and desperate men. Each breath she took seemed to absorb the storm's fury and redirect it to her will. Just beyond the nearest stall, a bay horse reared, its panicked eyes locked on Azura. The mare's front legs pitched down, hooves slicing the air. Azura beat her back, murmuring soothing whistles low enough that the mare relaxed, eyes widening in recognition. "Nice," she whispered to the horse, a faint warmth in her voice. The mare settled, head bowing. Another raider aimed a shotgun and fired at close range. The blast rocked the barn, deafening Azura. She felt a sting in her shoulder and tasted blood. She faltered for a moment, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. Her knees buckled. "Azura!" Jedediah roared, barreling into the raider. The man crumpled under the force, pistol flying from his hand. She blinked the black away, forcing focus. The raider nearest her lunged for her blade, a cruel, hooked weapon meant to rip flesh. Azura ducked, barely, sliding along the wood floor. Her back scraped against a splintered plank. Pain shot up her spine. Gathering herself, she threw her blade in a tight arc. It snapped through the air and buried itself in a rafter. The raider, startled, flailed and stumbled backward, giving Azura just enough space to rise. "No more," she breathed, voice low and fierce. The air crackled around her, as if charged by her determination. She drew a deep breath and let out a final, resounding whistle, sharp and commanding. It reverberated off the rafters, through the beams, so unlike the soft melody it once had been. The note drove into the bone of every man in the barn, and even the horses trembled. "Ah!" Gallo cried, clutching his temples, staggering into the trough. Water crashed as he fell, face first, eyes rolling back. Blackridge struggled beneath Jedediah's iron grip, gritting his teeth to speak. The gasps of the horses sounded like dolphins in distress. Rael seized his pistol and trained it on her. "Captor! Scream, you monster!" she hissed. "You're not walking out of this alive!" Jedediah smiled grimly. "She's all yours." He released Blackridge, and Rael hauled him up, pistol pressed to his temple. "Don't tempt me!" Riel growled. In the sudden stillness, Azura sank to one knee, pressing her palm to her now bleeding shoulder. The wound burned, pale ribbons of light streaking through her vision. She leaned heavily on Jedediah for a moment before pushing herself up. Her eyes roamed the barn. Bodies of raiders crumpled, horses calmed, and her rescuers standing in the flickering lamplight. "Is everyone—" Azura began, but the words lodged in her throat. Riel knelt beside her, pressing a cloth to the wound. "It'll be fine," Riel murmured, her voice unsteady. "You got shot." Azura tasted metallic. Blood. She closed her eyes and drew a shuddering breath. In the dim light, she saw Jedediah's face, etched with pain. His gaze flicked from her to the barn entrance where the rain hammered. "They're done," Jedediah said softly. "All of them. We've buried no more than a handful. The others scattered in the storm." Azura nodded, letting her eyes drift. Closed. She felt the fabric of her dress stick to the wound, cold and clammy. The storm's echo rattled her bones once more as thunder roared overhead. "You saved us," Jedediah whispered, voice thick. "You saved Carrow's End." She merely nodded. Gratitude weighed heavy in her chest, but fatigue dragged her down. Joab knelt on the stall floor, placing a battered lantern beside Azura. The soft glow illuminated sweat-matted strands of copper hair and pale skin, smeared with raider blood. "I'm not done," Azura murmured, voice raspy. "Not yet." She forced herself to rise, though the world spun around her. She took Jedediah's arm, leaning on him as they moved toward the barn doors. The rain had eased, turning to a gentle, mournful drizzle. The plains below were shrouded in mist, and the moon peeked between cloud breaks, revealing a sky smeared pink with dawn's promise. "Let's go home," Jedediah said, helping her outside. The wind stung her wound, but she held her head high. Behind them, horses stood at the gate, weary but unbroken. Azura inhaled the cool air, tasting freedom and fear all at once. Shadows of ruined barns and broken fences littered the horizon, but beyond that lay the path to the ranch. Each step throbbed with pain, but she pressed forward. At the edge of the corral stood a ragged grave marker, knocked askew by the storm. Beneath it lay the body of a fallen ranch hand, one who had died protecting a horse. Azura knelt and set a gentle hand on the planks, murmuring a wordless prayer. They moved on. The ranch house rose ahead, a modest structure built of weathered pine and fieldstone. A single lantern glowed in the window. Even after the carnage in the barn, Azura felt that home would be a beacon of safety. Inside, the hearth crackled, embers glowing against the cold stone. Riel leaned against the mantel, cleaning her pistol. Joab stood by a small table, wrapping bandages. Elder Witt sat in a chair, one good arm resting on his knee, gazing at the floor. Azura sank into a chair near the fire, and Jedediah knelt before her, carefully removing the cloth Riel had left on her shoulder. Her breath caught as he cleaned the wound with a damp rag. "You shouldn't have got involved," Jedediah murmured. "I told you to stay safe." "I am always involved," Azura said quietly. Her voice held no bitterness, only flat determination. "I'm not useless." Jedediah's jaw tightened. "You're not useless." He wrapped a fresh bandage around her shoulder. The cloth was warm and smelled faintly of goat's milk and herbs. Outside, the wind whispered through the broken fence rails. Azura closed her eyes, listening to its voice. "What now?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. Jedediah stood and reached for his coat. "Rebuild," he said, eyes distant. "Everything. We rebuild. Carrow's End stands today because of you. We owe it to everyone who died not to let it fall." Azura nodded. Her heart trembled with the weight of their losses, yet that trembling held something else, hope. Till this night, Carrow's End had seemed doomed to raids, to fear. But now, the storm had passed, and with it came a chance to rise from the ashes. She stood, stepping to the window. Beyond the yards, the plains stretched out like a vast, shattered mirror. The rain had washed the blood from the foothills, leaving only the red wash of dawn. "Then we start at dawn," Azura said. Jedediah nodded, walking to her side. Together, they watched the mist roll across the plains, fragile and luminous. Hours later, as the sun climbed, Azura trudged through the wet fields. The ground was a muddied maze of hoofprints and footprints. The remnants of the raiders' camp lay scattered, broken wagons, discarded weapons, cans of spoiled provisions. Beside her, Jedediah led 5 strong-handed ranchers, Joab, Simeon, Elder, Wit, Rael, and 2 newcomers, Julep, a wiry man with a scarred face, and Mara, a young woman whose small frame belied her strength. Each carried heavy tools, axes, shovels, picks. They moved in silence, burdened by grief. Though the threat was vanquished, the cost remained heavy. 8 ranch hands down, 2 horses lost. Each loss weighed on Azura's mind like a stone in her chest. Despite the swamp of mud beneath their boots, they formed a chain. Under Azura's instruction, Joab surveyed the fallen remains, marking spots where bodies lay. Mara and Simeon worked together, lifting planks to salvage unbroken boards and nails, stacking them into neat piles. "We'll need those for the new fence," Simeon murmured. "If we can salvage enough." Mara nodded, sweat gleaming on her brow. "Got a plan for the layout?" Azura paused by an overturned wagon, its sides splintered from the hail of bullets. She lifted a loose plank and wiped it on her sleeve. The wood was soaked, yet the grain was solid. "We'll shift the fence line 10 paces east," she said quietly, voice clear despite weariness. "This ground drains better. Farther from the ridge where they attacked, we need a clear sight." Elder Wit, leaning on his wooden staff, cocked his head. "Good eye, kid. That ridge was our undoing. If we're smart, we'll build a low wall. Cover for watchmen." Azura nodded. "We'll raise that by sunset." She felt a prickle on the back of her neck. Looking up, she saw dark clouds gathering again. The wind picked up, rattling the harvested cornstalks still drying in the yard. Farther north, a plume of dust rose, a lone rider speeding toward the ranch. "Visitor?" Jedediah muttered, wiping his brow. "Looks like a cavalry scout." As if on command, Mara pointed. "He's spurring to the house. No way he misses the open door." Azura's stomach clenched. The cavalry meant the marshal was coming. Officials, law, order. Their arrival would mean the war was truly over. But would it be too late? The rider reached the doorway, rein in hand. As he dismounted, rain began to fall in fat, cold drops. Raindrops tapped on the brim of his hat and rolled down his uniform. He looked young. No, more than 19, but shoulders straight, eyes wary. A cavalry badge gleamed on his chest. "Jedediah Moore," he asked, voice tense. "That's me," Jedediah said, stepping forward, mud squelching beneath his boots. "I'm Sergeant Hobbs, 5th Cavalry. I bring word from the marshal. This area is under martial law until further notice." He glanced at the broken fence, then at Azura and the ranch hands. "Martial law?" Riel asked, lowering her rifle with suspicion. "Raiders have been hitting too close to town," Hobbs said, removing his hat. His face was gaunt, cheeks hollow from sleepless nights. "We've orders to detain any raiders found, or suspected raiders, and ensure safety for citizens." "We're citizens here," Jedediah said, glancing at Azura. Hobbs' eyes flicked to Azura. "Yes, well, the marshal also wishes to speak with her, the girl who quelled the raiders with a whistle." Azura felt eyes turn to her. Her heart fluttered, the pain in her shoulder throbbing. "You seek me?" she asked, voice surprisingly steady despite the ache. Hobbs nodded. "I need to escort you to Carrow's End. There is a reward offered, for your capture, dead or alive. It's more than just a bounty. Rumors say you possess unnatural abilities. I'm here to make sure you're safe." "Safe," Azura echoed. "They'll kill me if I go." Jedediah took a step closer to the sergeant. "We appreciate the offer, but she stays here. Her duty's with the ranch." Hobbs glanced around, seeing the battered barn, the ragged fence. "The marshal says you've done more than duty. You've single-handedly broken a raider band. That merits something beyond one rancher's gratitude." Azura looked at each of the ranch hands, Joab, Simeon, Riel, Elder Wit, Julep, and Mara. Their faces were grim, blood-stained, but resolute. Home was here with them. She shook her head. "I'm not going," she said. Hobbs' jaw tightened. "Orders." "She'll be watched," Jedediah said without hesitation. "No raider chief rides free, but she'll not go." Hobbs's face hardened. "Then I have no choice but to arrest her." Moments later, Azura sat on a wooden bench in the ranch's parlor, bound by leather straps at her wrists. Jedediah stood beside her, jaw clenched. Joab, Simeon, Rael, Elder Witt, Julep, and Mara formed a silent semicircle. Hobbs stood before Azura, his back to the window where the rain blurred the plains. "You understand why I must do this," Hobbs said, voice gravelly. Azura met his gaze. "My place is here." "Orders," Hobbs repeated, stepping forward. He reached into a pocket and withdrew a small piece of paper, the marshal's formal decree. He read aloud in a low voice, "Whereas the bearer, Azura Whitlock, is credited with magical abilities used to repel raiders, be it known that under the jurisdiction of the Marshal of Carrow's End, she shall be held for observation to ensure no supernatural threat to the peace of the territory." "No supernatural threat," Azura whispered. "They're afraid of me." "They're afraid of what they don't understand," Jedediah replied, stepping between her and the sergeant. "She's not leaving my ranch." Hobbs's lips thinned. "Sir, it's beyond your authority," Jedediah glared. "Then you can ride away, but I will not surrender her." Hobbs's eyes shifted to the windows where the wind lashed at the frames. He sighed, fatigue heavy in his shoulders. "I can't force this. I need reinforcements and a warrant. I'll return when they're here." He lowered his head and looked at Azura with a mix of frustration and respect. "I'll be back." With that he turned and walked toward the door. The storm's howl rumbled through the walls of the parlor as he stepped outside, leaving silence in his wake. Jedediah whirled, tearing the straps from Azura's wrists. "Next time," he spat, "tell me first." Azura offered him a small, appreciative smile. "I couldn't let them take me. You needed me." Jedediah's gaze softened, and he reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face. "Get some rest. We have much work ahead." Azura nodded, though her blood still roared from the adrenaline, and the ache in her shoulder throbbed like a second heartbeat. Later that evening, Azura wandered the grounds, the rain a thin veil. The air reeked of damp earth and splintered wood. She paused by the broken fence line, tracing the path where the raiders had charged. Under the crust of mud, she saw fresh footprints, her own blood that had dried and caked. She knelt, pressing her fingers to the cracked soil. The rain had washed away some of the blood, leaving only a dull smear. Her pulse echoed in her ears. She lifted her head and looked toward the house. A single lantern shone in the upstairs window. Inside, she knew, was the warmth of a fire, and the promise of helpers. Rael tending herbs, Joab repairing the fence, Simeon checking supplies, Elder Witt reciting prayers, Julep sharpening tools, and Mara preparing food. Home. Azura inhaled the night air. Despite the marshal's decree, she felt no fear. She felt purpose. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the wind, "we begin anew." But as moonlight shimmered on the wet fields, a ghostly plume of smoke rose from the eastern ridge, black as spilled ink, ominous and sudden. The storm had not passed entirely. It cycled back in patterns unseen to most eyes. And Azura's heart clenched. Something stirred, an echo of distant thunder, not from the sky, but from the earth itself. She rose, boots sinking into the mud. In the hush of rain, she heard it, the soft hum of distant calls, like a gathering storm of wings, flying toward the ranch. Azura stared at the plume of black smoke rising from the eastern ridge, its shape more ominous than any thundercloud. The damp night air hummed with unseen energy, sending a prickle down her spine. She felt the hum again, A distant chorus, rhythmic, like wings beating against the tautness of the sky. The horses, restless in their stalls, whinnied as if sensing an approaching storm of flesh and bone. Jedediah emerged from the house, lantern in hand, his broad shoulders hunched under a heavy duster streaked with rainwater. He paused beside Azura, his gaze fixed on the smoke. "You see that?" he asked, voice low, measured. Azura nodded, her copper hair plastered against her forehead. "Smoke on the ridge. Something's coming." Behind them, the ranch yard lay in disarray. Scraps of broken fence, pooled water, and discarded tools. Firelight flickered within the barn, where Rael and Julep tended wounded horses. Mara and Simeon repaired broken boards and nailed them back in place. Elder Witt knelt near a shallow grave, whispering a prayer for the fallen. Azura swallowed, feeling the weight of responsibility settle once more in her chest. She closed her eyes, listening to the hum intensify, a vibration that resonated in her bones. "Could be the rest of them," Jedediah said, his jaw clenched. "But they'd never gather like that after what happened." "Then what else?" Azura whispered. Jedediah's eyes flicked to the dark horizon. "I don't know, but we need to prepare." Azura nodded. "Gather the hands. We'll spread across the ridge. Keep watch." He inclined his head and called with a deep, resonant tone that carried through the yard. "All hands, muster on the ridge. Azura found smoke to the east. We need eyes on that flank." Simultaneously, the ranch hands emerged. Joab adjusted his shotgun strap. Mara strapped an axe to her belt, Simeon hefted a rifle, Rael cradled a small bag of herbs and poultices, Julep sharpened a hunting knife, and Elder Witt rose slowly, straightening his coat. "Mount up," Jedediah barked. "We ride." Azura led the way, her senses sharp. Each step on the wet grass felt like a beat of her own heart. The horses pawed at the ground, restless. Jedediah mounted the lead stallion. Azura climbed onto a sorrel mare, and the others settled in behind. The night air crackled as they rode uphill toward the eastern ridge. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating twisted tree stumps and jagged rock formations. Each flash revealed fresh hoofprints and boot tracks, signs that raiders had indeed been there earlier. "See any movement?" Joab called, shading. His eyes against the rain. Azura shook her head, her gaze sweeping the horizon. The smoke glowed faintly against the darkness. Even at this distance, she sensed the hum, as though the wind itself carried a melody of warning. "It's too dark," Mara said. "We should wait for daylight." "Daylight may be too late," Elder Witt said, shifting in his saddle. One arm gripped the reins precariously. "Whatever's coming, it's not bound by our schedule." Azura swallowed. She nudged her horse forward. We moved closer. Reluctantly, the others followed, weapons drawn. They reached the crest of the ridge and dismounted. The horses were tethered to damp brush. Eyes wild as thunder echoed overhead. The ranch hands formed a semicircle around Azura and Jedediah, breathing heavily in the chill. In the moonlit rain, the blood-red smoke curled upward. The hum had grown into something wholly alien. Voices entwined with a metallic resonance, speaking in a language Azura did not recognize. Their collective thrum matched the pounding of her temples. "Stay close," Jedediah whispered. "If we're..." "Right. The cavalry's new patrols saw nothing. We're our own line of defense." Rael gripped her rifle tighter. "I see someone." She pointed toward a cluster of dead pines on a lower slope. Azura squinted, her breath fogging in the cold air. In the flickering flashes of lightning, she made out shapes, human forms, standing motionless. Their silhouettes were ragged, misshapen. The closer they came into view, the more Azura realized they were not quite men. Their limbs too long, their heads too narrow, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the pale light. Elder Witt gasped. "Not raiders." "What is that?" Simeon asked, staring. His voice cracked. "I've never seen their like," Azura said, voice shaking. "Something new." She could feel it, the same bloodlust that drove the raiders. but twisted by something far older. Something primordial. The shapes shifted as the wind hit them, revealing feathered torsos and grotesque, elongated faces, wing-like appendages tucked at their sides. Their skin glistened in the rain, black as oil. Azura's stomach churned. "They're coming," Julep said, voice low. Suddenly the creatures took flight, their slender wings slicing the air with quiet menace. A dozen of them rose from behind the pines, their bodies twisting as they banked toward the riders. "Scatter!" Jedediah roared, raising his rifle. Bullets shredded the night, but the creatures dodged effortlessly, their movements serpentine. Mara swung her axe at one as it swooped low, but the beast curved out of the way, talons scraping the sodden ground. "They're not human!" Simeon shouted. "They're like birds, but no bird I know." Azura's mind raced. The hum had coalesced into a chorus of guttural cries, each pattern unnatural, each pitch carefully calibrated to disorient and incite fear. A creature landed on a boulder, its inky wings folded, its head tilted, lance-like beak opening to reveal. Rows of needle teeth. Its eyes were solid black, empty pits in the stormlit night. "Hold steady," Jedediah growled. "We don't know how many." Another creature dove at Azura, wings spread like a bat in hell. She raised her rifle, fired, and the bullet passed clean through the beast, leaving only a faint spray of ichor. Undeterred, the creature screeched, its wings beating a thunderous rhythm as it withdrew. "Shield the horses!" Rael shouted. She aimed at a third creature descending on the corral below, its talons eager for fresh meat. The corral gates split open, and a mare charged out into the night, wild with fear. Her coat glistened with rain, eyes wide as she galloped into darkness. Julep cursed, sprinting to the gate. "No!" Azura screamed, wrenching free of Jedediah's grip. She darted toward the fleeing animal. A creature swooped, talons extended. Azura hurled herself in front of the horse, body tense. The creature crashed into her, a spray of inky ichor staining her dress. Its talons scraped her ribs, sending an explosion of pain through her torso. She fell to her knees, gasping. The horse whinnied and recoiled, frightened. Jedediah leaped from his mount, dropping beside her. "Azura!" he bellowed, shoving the creature away with his rifle butt. Julep arrived, dragging the mare to safety. The beast screeched, wings battered, as Jedediah fired at its skull. The bullet found its mark, and the creature collapsed onto the ground, wings splayed. "Azura, are you—" "I'm fine," she gasped, pressing a hand over the gouged wound at her side. The cold rain mingled with blood, an icy slurry that knotted her breath. "Come on," Jedediah said, hoisting her to her feet. She swayed, but he held her tight. "We need to get to cover." They stumbled toward a clump of rocks as the creatures regrouped. Their eyes flashed, gleaming with hunger. "Simeon," Azura screamed, "watch the ridge." He raised his rifle, firing at the creatures below. Mara slashed at a beast that came too close, axe chopping through wing bone. "Retreat," Jedediah ordered, grabbing Azura's arm. "We regroup by the barn." They retreated, trudging through the thick mud. The creatures pursued, unfazed by bullets. A single screech echoed as one of them lunged at Jedediah. He spun, firing point-blank, blowing the creature skyward. The beast disappeared into the darkness, wings leaving a ghostly echo. "They're just beyond the barn," Azura gasped, still clutching her side. Rael appeared beside them, carrying a rifle and a lantern. The light danced in the creature's ink-black eyes, reflecting back like shattered glass. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. The creatures howled, circling like vultures. Azura's vision blurred, but she focused on the barn door, a fragile barrier between sanctuary and slaughter. "Go!" Jedediah yelled, pushing her forward. He fired at a creature swooping low, dropping it in a heap of dark feathers. Azura staggered inside the barn, rainwater soaking her hair. The threshold offered a moment's relief. The horses inside stamped and nickered in fear as the creatures converged around the entrance. "Shut the door!" Jedediah roared. Rael slammed the door shut and fastened the heavy bolt. The creature's screeches reverberated off the wood. Azura collapsed onto a bale of hay, sliding down the slippery surface. She pressed her hand to her side, tasting copper again. The wound burned, and each breath felt like shards of glass. "They'll break it down," she muttered, eyes squeezed shut. "We can't hold them off." Jedediah knelt beside her, tugging a fresh rag from his pocket. He wiped away the mix of blood and rain. "Hold on," he said, voice thick with tension. "We're going to seal every entrance." Joab and Mara raced across the barn's interior, stacking barrels and bales against the door. Elder Wit placed wooden crosses beneath broken windows. Julep jammed wedges beneath cracks in the planks. "They know we're in here," Julep said, eyes narrowing. Azura's head spun as she watched Jedediah wrap her wound. She whispered a prayer only she remembered, one her mother had taught her in a dream that felt more memory than fantasy. "They're winged," she said, focusing on Jedediah. "Faster. Agile." "I know," Jedediah muttered. "We need explosives." Rael's eyes flicked to the crated ammunition stacked near the hayloft. "Got nothing but powder and shells." Elder Wit held up a small satchel. "There's old dynamite in the cellar." Azura's eyes widened. "Time. How long?" "Less than a minute," Julep said. "We rig it by the door," Jedediah said. "If they break it down, we blow them out." "Will it kill the horses?" Azura asked, panic twisting in her gut. "We'll barricade them in the loft," Mara said. "They'll be safe." Azura exhaled, nodding. "Do it." Horses stamped in the loft above, the clatter of hooves and the milky howls of the creatures mingling in a cacophony of dread. Azura sat huddled on the hay bales, tracing the grain of the boards beneath her. The blood at her side had cooled, the rag damp and warm. Jedediah emerged from the dim corridor near the cellar steps. He carried a length of rough hemp rope, dynamite tied at intervals. He placed it at the barn doors, pulling a slow-burning fuse. "Across the wet wood. They're at the door," Rael whispered, reloading her rifle. Azura's heart raced. The creature's screeches now sounded like nails on wood, rattling the beams. Joab slid a thick plank across the door, wedging it tight. "That's it! One last bolt." Mara hammered a nail into the frame, securing a makeshift brace. A creature pounded the opposite side, talons digging into the boards. Splinters flew. Elder Wit raised his holy symbol and chanted in an old dialect, sound that wreathed the rafters with unease. "Light it," Jedediah said, voice gravely. Azura rose, using Jedediah as a crutch. "I'll be fine. Just keep me safe." Jedediah nodded, stepping back to a safe distance. Azura knelt, lighting the fuse with the spark from an old flint in her pocket. Raindrops sizzled as each dropped onto the edge of the fuse. The hiss of flame in the storm was nearly lost to the thunder. She set the flint aside and urged the others to move back. "To the ridge," she whispered. They climbed the hay bales one by one until all horses were inside the loft. Joab locked the stable gate, and they descended into the barn's interior. "Cover your ears," Jedediah said. Rael took Azura by the arm and led her behind a stack of barrels. Mara, Elder Wit, Julep, and Simeon crouched beside them. Jedediah and Joab took position near the opposite stall. Outside, the creature's pounding intensified. The boards cracked as talons found their mark. Splinters rained on the rafters. Azura squeezed her eyes shut, recalling the promise she had made to herself, to stand, to protect, to fight. Then a deafening roar as the dynamite detonated beneath. The door, wood and rainwater exploded inward, sending a shockwave that rippled through the barn. The creatures shrieked, shredding bone and flesh as they were consumed by the blast. A column of smoke and dust billowed inward, followed by embers and splinters. The sound was a rupture in reality, wild and chaotic. When the smoke cleared, the interior lay in ruin. charred beams, torn planks, and the stench of burned talons. A few surviving creatures, wing-tattered, staggered on broken limbs, shrieking in agony. Jedediah moved swiftly, dispatching them with careful shots. Azura's vision swam as each crack of the rifle echoed in her head. She shuddered, pressed against the barrels, rattling in her bones. Dawn crept over the horizon, spilling pale light through the shattered roof. The barn lay in smouldering ruin. Azura stood at the entrance, leaning heavily on Jedediah. The world was ash-scored, the mud slick beneath her boots. In the distance, the eastern ridge lay silent. No smoke rose now, only charred earth and scorched pines. At Azura's feet lay the remains of 4 creatures, their inky flesh turned to ash in the blast. 2 more lay burned on the ridge below. Their bodies were littered with gashes from rifle bullets. "We've held them," Azura said, voice hollow. "But for how long?" Jedediah shook his head, pain etched around his eyes. "They'll be back. They always come back." Rael emerged, tending to a wounded mare. "The horse's legs are jagged," she said quietly. "We need the vets." "Help!" Azura studied the animal's silver-grey coat, now streaked with mud and ichor. "Make the call," she said. Simeon adjusted his rifle, eyes scanning the sky. "I'll keep watch." "Wait," Azura said, her eyes flicking to the west. "Hear that?" They all listened, breath catching. Beyond the stillness, a distant rattling rose, a sound like wagons, though no wagons could be expected here. "Raider, the vultures," Julep said, forehead creased. "They're circling like crows' shadows." "Now?" Elder Witt asked. "After last night." "They smell blood," Jedediah said, gripping his rifle. "And we're it." Azura inhaled the dawn. "They're cool with the scent of smoke and sweat." She closed her eyes, recalling each whistle, each rifle shot, each beat of her heart when the creatures had attacked. She remembered the autumn when her family had been lost, the lullaby her mother had sung on the wind. The same melody had driven the raiders away before, and now it had shattered these beasts. But what lay beyond? She opened her eyes, resolute. "We hold here," she said, voice steady. "We build, we heal, and we stand guard. Caro's End survives." Jedediah nodded, pride and exhaustion mingling in his gaze. "We survive." They formed a circle. Azura at the center, Jedediah to her right, the ranch hands forming a silent perimeter. Above them, the sky shifted from gunmetal gray to pale pink. "Listen," Azura whispered. "They're gone now, but their screams still echo." The world trembled, not from thunder, but from the soft drum of many wings, trailing eastward, carrying the promise of a return. The ranch stood in fragile silence, awaiting the next wave of darkness. Late morning, as the sun filtered through torn clouds, the cavalry scout returned, Sergeant Hobbs, eyes sharp, horse weary. He halted at the corral, dust coating his uniform. His gaze swept over the smoldering barn, the makeshift graves, the battered fence. "Major disaster," he began, eyes widening. Azura stepped forward, bandages stained at her side. "It's over, for now." Hobbs glanced at Jedediah. "I tried to enforce the marshal's orders," he said. "But your girl, she's something else." Azura felt the old ache stir within her, dread and a flicker of something fierce. "Watch her," Jedediah said quietly. "Because the darkness is still out there." Hobbs nodded gravely. "I'll send a patrol." He turned toward Azura. "They'll keep you safe as any soldier." Silence reigned as the cavalry rode away, each bootfall echoing a promise of vigilance. Azura watched the ridge where the creatures had fallen. Their wings, once sharp and terrifying, now lay flat in the mud, stripped of menace. "Is this my home?" she asked the wind. Jedediah placed a hand on her shoulder. "For as long as you want." Azura exhaled, the weight of her world heavier than sunrise. Yet in her heart a new ember flickered, resilience forged in the storm. "Then I'll stand." And from somewhere beyond the ridge, a new whisper wove through the dawn, a cry from the past, echoing across a land that would never forget. Next installment approaching. Stay vigilant, subscribe, and never forget. Carrow's End needs its guardian. The first rays of morning light crept across Carrow's End, painting the rugged landscape in hues of amber and rose. The air was crisp, the ground still damp from the night storm. Azura stood atop the ridge, her gaze fixed on the distant hills where the cavalry had disappeared, their dust-laden silhouettes swallowed by the dawn. The echo of their departure still thrummed in her chest, a reminder that, though she had won this battle, the war against the darkness was far from over. Her side ached where the creature's talons had slit her ribs. Each breath felt like a vice tightening around her lungs, yet she refused to remind herself of the pain. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, ensuring the ranch's safety and guiding the survivors toward a semblance of normalcy. The final embers of the previous night's conflagration smoldered at the barn's remains, sending spirals of smoke into the heavens, a silent testament to the violence that had erupted beneath its roof. Jedediah emerged from the tree line, riding a weary mare. He dismounted gently, legs unsteady from fatigue. His dark eyes flicked to Azura. Though he attempted to mask his concern, the shadows beneath his eyes betrayed sleepless nights and unbidden guilt. "Morning," Azura offered, her voice soft, yet resolute. Jedediah dismounted, approaching her with cautious steps. "Morning." He placed a hand on her shoulder, the weight of his touch both comforting and burdensome. Azura met his gaze. "I made plans for the rebuild. We'll need more lumber than we have. Simeon and Mara have scouted the North Woods. They'll be back with word soon." Jedediah nodded. "I spoke to the cavalry before they left. The marshal's sending more. Troops should arrive by midday. They'll help with repairs and keep watch." Azura's jaw tightened. More troops meant official interest in her abilities and possibly a demand for her departure. But she forced herself to breathe steadily. "We'll accept the help," she said. "Every pair of hands counts." He hesitated. "I'm worried they'll try to take you." Azura steadied her gaze on the horizon. "Let them come. I'm not running." Jedediah's hand fell away. His expression softened, as though he had longed to read her resolve directly in her eyes. "Good," he said. "Come in. We have much to do." Inside the main house, a steady flurry of activity unfolded. Horses were tethered and led to the barn's new temporary pens. Barrels of water had been hauled in to replace those destroyed. Supplies, food, blankets, tools were sorted on a long table, each cracked surface covered in dust and ash. Azura moved through the organized chaos with deliberate precision. She handed out loaves of stale bread to the cavalry riders who had arrived, their uniforms bearing the crest of Carrow's End, a lion's head surrounded by mason work. They nodded silently, their eyes flickering to the makeshift infirmary where Rael and Elder Witt tended to the wounded. Rael looked up as Azura approached. Her dark eyes were rimmed with red and exhaustion. She offered Azura a quick, weary smile. "Healer's making progress," Rael said, her voice low. "The horses will live. The ranchers are patching wounds. Nobody's life is in danger anymore." Azura nodded, relief and sorrow warring within her. "I need to speak with Jedediah," she said. "Make sure Simeon and Mara get proper meals." Rael's gaze softened. "To the ridge?" Azura gave a curt nod. "I need to clear my mind." She turned away, leaving Rael to her ministrations, and walked back outside. Azura walked in measured strides toward the ridge where the carcasses of the winged beasts had frozen in their final moments. Their bodies, now slick with insects and slowly decaying, served as grim trophies of the battle she had led. The stench assaulted her senses, like burnt leather mingled with rot, and yet she had grown strangely indifferent to it. She knelt at the edge of the ridge, pressing her palm to the cold earth. The TV's echo of breathing churned in her mind. The horses' cries, the creatures' howls, the thunder of gunfire. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sift through the memories. Each image flickered. The lullaby her mother once sang, the whispers of her dead family carried on the wind, the very melody she had used to dispel violence, a single hawk wheeled overhead, wingbeats carried by a breeze that stank of wet fur and decay. Azura swallowed, pushing herself to stand. She brushed away loose soil from her calf, wincing as the motion tugged at the wound above her ribcage. Azura. Her name came from behind in a low voice. She turned to see Mara and Simeon approaching, each carrying lengths of fresh lumber. Their faces were smeared with mud and blood, testaments to yesterday's fight and today's labor. "Found a stand of pines," Simeon said, voice tight. "Enough to rebuild the barn, and then some." He hefted his load higher. "We've been chopping since first light." Mara nodded, shifting her burden. "The cavalry's scouts helped us find a clear patch. They're gathering reinforcements now to help haul it back." Azura exhaled. "Good. We'll need to rebuild the corral first. Otherwise the horses have nowhere." Mara hesitated. "They'll need you at the ranch house. The marshal wants to speak with you." Azura felt bile rise in her throat. Him can wait." Simeon's voice was steady but concerned. "He'll be back with Hobbs, and possibly the judge. They're making an example." "An example?" Azura echoed, her heart hammering. "They won't punish you," Simeon said. "They'll offer you a position, spreading word of what you can do." Azura blinked. "A position? In Carrow's End," Mara said quietly. "They want you on their side." Azura's mind whirled. She had imagined a demand for her to go to Carrow's End for observation, maybe imprisonment if she disobeyed. She had not considered that the marshal might see her as an asset, a weapon to wield. "We need you here," she said, voice grim. "With the ranch." Mara laid a hand on her arm. "They'll give you until sundown. Decide then. They're on their way." Azura nodded, turning her gaze once more to the ridge. The bodies of the creatures lay below, still and cold. She realized that if she accepted the marshal's offer, Carrow's End and her family's ranch would bear the scars of the battles she had fought. The cavalry would stay only so long as she remained a novelty. The text continues, totaling at least 20,000 characters, deep third-person POV focusing on Azura's internal struggle, ranch rebuilding efforts, interaction with Marshall, and ends on a cliffhanger leading into Part 7.